Charles Purcell presents.
Well, it's been a quiet week down at Blinknmissit Corners, my hometown. You know Blinknmissit Corners, right? It's down where Highway N meets County Road X. Sure. Good old Blinknmissit Corners. Founded back in 1803 by the Blinknmissit family. The patriarch of the family, of course, was Nels, his wife Agnes, and their sons Irvin, Harold, and Ken. Yeah, they hailed from Sweden originally. The two, Agnes and Nels, came over as kids over on the boat, and they wound up in southeastern Wisconsin. Of course, it sits right there, pretty close to the Illinois border. In fact, whenever the cousins come down to visit from Escanaba, Michigan, they're always very impressed. I remember Scott saying to his mother, "Hey, did you know that we're just right close to Illinois?" He couldn't believe it. Of course, they were up there in Escanaba in northern Michigan, and so that was very impressive to them. Oh boy, Chicago's just right there. We were the big time, being so close to Illinois. So the Blinknmissits back in the day, they were in on the ground floor of sand. That was their game. They had a little sand pit that they operated, and it's still there to this day. Of course, they lost everything, or darn near everything, when the sand game just the bottom fell out of it. But they back in the day, back all through the 1800s, the Blinknmissit family was synonymous with sand, and that old sand pit was going 24 hours a day, providing sand to all the neighboring territories. And Blinknmissit Corners, the town was humming there for a while. It never got too big, but it was a bustling place. But that lasted, I don't know, 100 years or more. But by the early part of the 20th century, it was winding down, and Blinknmissit was just a little speck on the map there. So as I say, the old sand pit is still there, and I was quite familiar with that as a boy. It was just about a half-hour walk or so. It was about a half-hour walk from our house. Step out the back porch, through the screen door, and through the backyard and through the sports field, and then through the cow pastures, which was very pleasant, soft rolling hills, and of course you had to watch your step for the cow pies. And there was the occasional fence we'd have to maneuver. Of course, they had the barbed wire and sometimes even electric fences, and that was the big game as a kid. Well, is that turned on or not? The electric fence. We'd whack it with sticks, and we'd pee on it. We'd take great chances. So anyway, they'd go through the pastures, and then you'd get to the sand pit, which was no longer operating, as I say. But there it was, this big pile of sand. Well, actually, what it was, it kind of looked like a big hole cut out of a hill, and you open up this hill, and there's all the sand inside. It was quite a sight. I guess I never knew much about the business of sand, but I don't know. Is that how you get it? You just cut open a hill, and maybe there's sand inside, like opening up the secret center of a piece of candy or something. I don't know. But what happened was, then at the top of the hill was it turned out to be kind of a cliff that we as kids, it seemed like as high as the Empire State Building. We get up on the top of that cliff, And then below us, as you're standing on the cliff, was this hill of sand, this slowly tapering hill of sand. And even though it was so high, you could just take a flying leap off the top of that cliff, and you'd just land in the soft, sloping sand, no harm done, and lots of fun. So we spent lots of time out at the sand pit, even though our parents forbade us from going there because it was too dangerous. And it was kind of the perfect situation because it was far enough from home that you felt like you were really, out on your own as a kid. But it was close enough for my mom to stand on the back stoop and holler as loud as she could, "Dinner!" And we'd hear her. She was close enough to holler. She had a pretty good voice on her. I mentioned the sports field. You probably wonder what that is. Well, in our yard, our particular property, we had the regular backyard, which was nice soft grass, and that was very pleasant. We had a couple of cherry trees and a little grapevine winding around some pillars there, and it was very nice, very nice. And then at one point, there was another patch if you keep walking toward the sand pit. And I guess that was still our yard, but the parents never went there. It was just this big, large patch of craggy grass and crabgrass. And now that I think about it, it was always mowed, so I guess our dad was doing that for us because we used that as for our sports, and that's why we called it the sports field. Right down at one end, on the near end toward the house, was right in the darn middle of the lawn there was a little patch of rhubarb that came up every year. It drove my dad crazy. It just came up. It was this wild rhubarb. In fact, we had all sorts of wild. We had wild asparagus and currant bushes, the little berries, and apple trees, and I mentioned the cherry trees and the grapes. Oh my goodness, if any time you were hungry as a kid in the summertime, just go outside and there was plenty to eat, not to mention swiping carrots and green beans from my dad's garden. We had to help weed the garden, which was kind of torture as a kid, but it was nice to swipe a carrot, wash it off there with the hose, and if you ever ate a carrot from a store, you have no idea what you're missing if you've only eaten carrots from stores. Anyway, so yeah, we had lots of my dad's garden and lots of wild things growing, including this rhubarb, which was the bane of my dad's existence. And he'd try to get rid of it. Every year, every spring, he would dig in there and try to get it out by the roots. But then the next year, oh Lord Almighty, it would come right up again, and he'd try it again in the fall. But whatever he would do, that little wild patch of rhubarb would always come right back up every year. So we made that home base. The little patch of rhubarb was our home base for our baseball games in the what we called the sports field. That was where my brother and I went out one Christmas morning, before the sun even came up, I might add, with 2 feet of snow on the ground. But we were out there in the sports field because on Christmas morning we got football helmets and shoulder pads and a brand new football. So we just insisted that we go out and play with them. And my mother said, "Well, there's 2 feet of snow on the ground and it's not even light outside. It's dark. Why don't you at least wait a little while?" No, we have to go out and play with our football helmets. And so, yeah, that was out in the sports field. Well, let's see. What else happened this week down in Blinknmissit Corners? Well, let's see. Was it this week or was it 50 years ago? I don't recall. It's one of the two. It doesn't really make a difference. My parents had a garage, an unattached garage. It was separate, and that's a pretty good thing for a kid to have an unattached garage, because you could get away with things there that you might not get away with otherwise. And this particular garage had kind of an attic to it. Really, it was just the beams. There was kind of the roof, of course, was pitched in the middle, and the area above the beams my dad would use for storage, and throw a few plywood planks up there over the beams, and then you got room for storage. And there was a staircase that you could pull up from the top once you're up there. Well, we used it as our little clubhouse, and of course my dad's workbench was in the garage, and the vise, which we had lots of fun crushing things with. You could crush nuts in a vise, or you could bend, very heavy nails, and you could even crush small pebbles, or you could put army men in there, or pieces of my sister's Barbie doll, marbles, all sorts of things we put in the vise and act out our more destructive tendencies. So that was, as you can imagine, for a kid, that was pretty good. So just this past week, or was it 50 years ago? I don't know for sure. One of the things we did in our little clubhouse, which was pretty much just me and my brother and the racer kid. His name was Racer. That was his actual last name, and his first name was Johnny. So his name was Johnny Racer. And I always found that a little odd. It's well, you're a toy. You sound like a toy. You don't sound like a person with a name like Johnny Racer. You're a toy or a cartoon character, for gosh sakes. But that was his actual name, and he was a bad influence on us. He was like the Eddie Haskell to Wally and Beaver. I was the Beaver. My brother was the Wally, and Johnny Racer was Eddie Haskell. I very much identified with that show. So Johnny Racer was a bad influence on us. And I remember there was another kid named Skeleton. No, it was Skelton. What was his name? Rick, I think. Rick Skelton. Sure. Everybody else called him Skeleton, now that I think about it, as a joke, as kind of a taunt, and I felt kind of bad for him, because here was this kid who was obviously, I don't know if his parents were poor or what his story was, but he was all pretty disheveled. His hair was always dirty and matted and standing up in the corners. And he just had grime on his face, and his clothes had holes and wrinkles, and as I say, he just put on a very poor appearance. We didn't know much about him except that, he looked poor and different, so kids picked on him. And I remember feeling sorry for him. That was the first time I noticed that most people are assholes. And I tried not to be an asshole, but I certainly fell into that trap more often than not. But with this case, with little Ricky Skelton, which the other kids called Skeleton because he was also very thin. And so, yes, he's dirty and thin, and on top of all that, he had this pretty large glop of green snot coming out of his left nostril, and it just was kind of permanent. It never went away. It was always there. It didn't drop down further. He never sniffed it up. He never wiped it away. It was always, whenever I saw him, there it was, like a permanent feature on his face, this big green slop of snot just kind of resting there above his lip, coming out of his left nostril. So I tried to befriend Rick Skelton, but that never got too far. But at least I didn't pick on him like the other kids did. I was kind of sensitive. When I was a boy, I wanted to be a priest. I was, of course, the Catholic Church was very big down there in Blinknmissit Corners. Everybody went down to the Catholic Church. St. Joseph's it was. And of course, they had their service again just this past week, or was it 50 years ago? Don't recall. There was a little bit of a controversy. Father Hickey, yes, that was his name, Father Hickey, because little Shelley Winstead, the youngest of the Winstead families, only in like this, I think maybe second grade down there at St. Joseph's School. And Father Hickey comes up to her and said, well, how's everything, little Shelley? How's the family? Oh, good, She's just a little girl, so what's she going to say? And well, then, at least according to Shelley, who reported back to her parents because it made her very uncomfortable, Father Hickey starts asking all sorts of questions about the family. Well, how's your older brother Billy? Oh, fine. And then don't you have another older brother who's like 12? What's his name? Oh, sure. His name is Jimmy. Billy and Jimmy. Oh, right. Now Father Hickey's very interested in Jimmy, and he starts asking all sorts of questions. Well, what's Jimmy like, and does he drink, or does he go out with the girls? Has he ever touched you? Well, this was just completely confusing to little Shelley, but she knew she could just feel in her bones there was something very wrong with this line of questioning that was coming from Father Hickey. So she ran home and told her parents about it, and the very next day, Shelley was no longer in St. Joseph's School. She was in public school the rest of her days. My parents bought our house from a guy named Old Man Robers, and the deal that my dad had with Old Man Robers was that, well, he could continue to use part of the property because it was kind of an interesting thing. He had a chicken coop, which didn't have any chickens in it. Old Man Robers, I guess, used to keep chickens. It's not like we were out in the country. We were just on the edge of town. We were the last house in town. Right next to us was a farmer's field. So it kind of had that little bit of a country feel to it. So he kept chickens, so there was still the old chicken coop. Of course, it was pretty old and rickety, and it's another place that we were forbidden to visit. We weren't supposed to go into the chicken coop because it was dangerous, and there was, I don't know, nails or barbed wire or rickety construction, and well, it was. My parents considered it kind of a place we shouldn't be, so they told us not to go in there. Well, so, of course, that was one of our favorite places to go, and it was another clubhouse, kind of like the garage attic, kind of like the garage I was telling you about. There was also a little bit out on the edge of the sports field. To this day, I'm not sure what you call it, a little well or a little cistern or something. All I remember is that it was just big enough for me to kind of lift up the lid and crawl down inside of it and just kind of sit there. And I considered that my own private clubhouse, and I remember taking comic books and things, and I'd just sit there in this little well, kind of like, Saddam Hussein, and sit there and read my comic books with a flashlight. But what was I saying? Oh, Old Man Robers, yeah. The deal that my dad had with him was that he could continue to use part of the property because he also kept bees. He had some bees that he kept. And so there was this little shack with Mr. Robers' tools and things, and then the place where he kept bees. So even though it was my dad's property, he had an arrangement with Old Man Robers that he could still come in and use that little shack. So, of course, there was another clubhouse of ours because we were forbidden to ever go inside Old Man Robers' shack because, well, of course, it didn't belong to us. It belonged to him. So, of course, where do you want to be? Well, we wanted to be in there. So we'd be in there, another kind of a little clubhouse, and we'd keep an eye out. And, the most exciting thing that ever happened was when Old Man Robers would stop by while we were in there, because then we'd yell, "Oh, Old Man Robers is coming." So we'd hightail it out of there. And, of course, in retrospect, he was kind of a cool guy who kept chickens and bees, and someone I'd probably admire greatly today. But at the time, we just thought we knew everything, and everybody, all adults and people who weren't like us were, we just thought the worst of them. Well, what's wrong? Kids can be just the worst. Kids are the worst, especially the boys, I'd have to say. I mean, that was my experience anyway. It was with the boys. I think maybe that's when I first questioned. I was first questioning my gender without knowing it. It's only in retrospect that I look back and think, well, I just didn't really relate to the boys at all. All the fighting and the spitting and the cursing and the misogyny and sexism were words, of course, I didn't know, but I was very aware of how we boys were supposed to feel about the girls, and I didn't like any of it. So it was only years later that I think back and I thought, well, maybe it's when we become more aware of gender identity. I guess I was kind of I was on the gender scale there elsewhere because I couldn't relate to the boys at all. I remember my confirmation at St. Joseph's. We had all the boys and girls of, the certain age, you turn 12 or 13 or whatever it is and you get confirmed. You know that one? It's kind of like the Jewish bar mitzvah. It's the Catholic version of that. Well, we're all sitting in the pews. It's an evening. It's a Friday evening maybe before the big Sunday event when we're all going to be confirmed. And we're trying to have kind of a rehearsal, kind of a run-through. They're telling us how it's all going to go down, where we sit and when we stand and get up and, kind of like a wedding rehearsal. Well, I remember like it was yesterday. Maybe it was yesterday. Now I can't recall. But, the boys were just completely out of control. And the poor parish priest, Father Hickey, and the nuns are trying to get them under control. But they're squirming and shouting and pushing each other. And there's just this kind of din of noise and uproar. And I remember sitting there just watching all the other boys, every one of them, tugging at their ties and tugging at each other and making this big scene. And I noticed all the girls also were looking at the boys and thinking, well, what is wrong with them? These ruffians, these animals who can't seem to, well, of course, now we know that it's just kids are kids, but I don't know. I don't get it. And I was kind of with the girls, and it took me a long time to realize that, well, I guess I just wasn't like the other boys. So anyway, what was I talking about? Oh, yeah, Johnny Racer. I remember one time, one of the worst things he did, he came upon this big snapping turtle down by the little creek that ran just adjacent to our property there, my parents' house. And my goodness, he tortured this poor snapping turtle, first with, putting a stick in its mouth and watching it snap, and we're all kind of having a good time. But then he pulls out his BB gun. Johnny Racer had a BB gun. We all did back in the day. And he's shooting at it, and he's whacking at it with the stick, and he's shooting it with his BB gun, and basically just kind of torturing. I even hate to say it out loud. The memory is very disturbing. But, of course, the snapping turtle would open its mouth wide to snap at the stick or the gun, the barrel of the gun. Johnny Racer would shoot BBs right into the poor turtle's mouth. And, all the boys, of course it was all boys at the time, no girls allowed. One of the many things that made us assholes. We were, kids can be jerks, and we were jerks. What can I say? Oh, we did all sorts of obnoxious things when we were kids. We'd throw dirt balls or apple bombs at the passing cars right in front of our house. What we do is we climb up on into a tree, and we were playing war, of course, because that's what you do. We played cowboys and Indians, and we played war because those are what we saw on the television, the old movies and such. So, yeah, we'd see a car coming by. It wasn't a busy highway. It was a little, again, Blinknmissit Corners, just a small town, but cars would go by occasionally, and we'd climb up in a tree, and the first kid to see one coming, they'd say, oh, here it comes. And they were like the enemy tanks coming in. We were playing war. And we'd throw apples at the cars as they passed by. Now, what kind of thing is that to do? We were jerks. Kids could be jerks. Getting back to Johnny Racer, what he did one summer up in the attic of the garage, which is what we called it again. It was just above the beams with a few plywood planks making the floor. But we took a big can, the kind of can that Dad stored nails in or nuts or bolts or things like that. We took a big old coffee can up there. And whenever we had to urinate, whenever we had to relieve ourselves, do the old number one, we'd go up to the garage attic, and relieve ourselves in the coffee can. And then after a while, the coffee can became full, and it was a big can, one of the big oversized cans. And with the idea that we would pull kind of a carry episode here, we'd dump it on our enemies. So on the given day when we had a full can of ammunition, we got on our bikes. Of course, you had the playing card clothespined to the frame of the bike, so it would flap, 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 flap along on the spokes, so you sound like a motorcycle, right? Everybody does that. Y'all do that, right? Sure. So we would go out then, and we fancied ourselves kind of a motorcycle gang with a rival gang on the other side of town. And if you go out on any given summer afternoon in Blinknmissit Corners, you're going to find kids on their bikes. And so we found this rival gang and taunted them with our verbal abuse and got them to chase us, right? So the idea was then that we'd get them to chase us into my parents' garage. And then right at the right moment, we'd get them under the rafters, under the rafters of the garage attic. And we'd pour the large coffee can and the contents therein on their heads. So that's what we did. So that happened just this past week, or maybe it was 40, 50 years ago. It's one of the two. I'm not sure. See, that's the thing with nostalgia. They tell us, all the researchers tell us, that when people get a little older, the very long-term memories from their childhood are the last ones to go. Those are the ones that remain the longest. I'm not sure of the causal relationship there. It might be turned around. I think maybe it's just a thought that comes to mind. I think spending a little too much time in nostalgia will make you a little daft. I don't know. I tend not to express opinions about things I'm not sure about. That's why I stick to the stories that are first-person stories about Blinknmissit Corners, my hometown, where all the women wear aprons and smoke Viceroy filter tips, where all the men drive Chryslers and smoke Pall Mall Straights, and all the children are assholes.
This episode of Charles Purcell Presents is available right now wherever you find your podcasts. Or go to the website charlespurcell.com for the full archive and all the other series in the podcast family. Follow, comment, and contact me on Facebook and Twitter. Thanks to our flagship station, Riverwest Radio, riverwestradio.com. Theme music composed and performed by Peter Donalds. From the New Arts and Media Studios in Milwaukee, I'm Charles Purcell.